Hi friends, and welcome to Behind the Forum. This is our video series that goes a little bit deeper than the Bonita Christian Forum, where we're recording behind the scenes with our guests for this evening. This evening, our guest is the former governor of the state of Wisconsin and the now president of the Young Americans Foundation, Mr. Scott Walker. Scott, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's such a privilege to have you here.
Good to be here.
Good to have you. Let me begin right away with your political career. You had an amazing political career in the state of Wisconsin. You inherited a $3.6 billion budget deficit. You were able to turn it around without cutting those major areas and without laying folks off. What was it like for you? I know it wasn't always easy during that time period. What was it like to be the governor?
Well, early on, it was obviously a great challenge, but I knew that coming in. About a year and a half out, when I made the decision after a lot of prayer and thought and time with our family, part of the reason we did what we did was we knew the state was in trouble. And I went to visit the governor at that time of Indiana, Mitch Daniels, who I thought was a really great example of how to get things done. And so I did something, I guess, a little unusual in politics. I decided I needed to figure out if I could do the job first before I ran for the job. Sometimes it's the other way around. And so we took action right away. And even though obviously there were some people both in-state and more specifically nationally who didn't always like what we did, the choices we made, as you mentioned, we avoided massive layoffs, we avoided massive cuts to things like Medicaid that would have hurt needy families, seniors, and others in need. We avoided a massive tax increase that would have been devastating when the economy in our state, the year I ran, started out with 9.2% unemployment. So it was tough, but we knew it was the right decision. And so because we started out on the right approach, we were able to see our way through it.
Yeah. So while you were governor, you were a deeply faithful man. That faith comes from your roots. Your father was a Baptist minister. Talk to us a little bit about how your father's influence shaped who you became and even how you approached your work in office.
Yeah, my dad was, a number of things to this day still stick with me. One, he always said, all of us are called to minister, just some are ordained. And so, you have to minister where you're at. It was particularly fitting after that because when I was young, I'd often fill in, not only for my father, I was from a small town, so after people realized I could speak from the pulpit, a few of the other ministers in town sometimes would ask me to fill in when they went on vacation or things like that. And so by the time years later I entered public service, there were some people in my dad's church in the congregation who I remember once asked him, I said, how could your son go into something like this? We thought he was going to be a minister. How could he go into something so awful, so dirty? And my dad said, well, what kind of people do you want in public service? Don't you want godly people?
Yeah,
and so that was a really helpful reminder for me was that just because it's in government and politics and not necessarily directly in the church doesn't mean you're not a part of God's ministry. In fact, in some ways, it's as much or more in how you live and how you operate. You can have differing views from others, but how you treat other people goes a long way. And I would just add, it wasn't just my father. My father certainly, from the time I was barely able to stand, was called up to pray or read the responsive reading. So I was very comfortable communicating that way. But my mother, who many would say was as quiet as a church mouse, she probably had as much or a greater influence on me because of the way she treated other people was always a great reminder to me and in turn to our children that how you judge people when others are not looking is as important as what you do in front of the pulpit or in my case in front of the microphone.
Your Christian faith is such a deep part of who you are. One of my favorite things I've heard you say in different conversations, but also read in your book, is that your daily devotional life has often influenced whatever interactions you're having during a particular day. Can you think of some particular examples that you've had where your daily devotions were just given by God for you or for somebody else?
Right. Well, it was a combination of both. I mean, there often were times either devotionals, or I remember once I was rushing to a plane flying around the state in the midst of all the protests. And put in context, we had about 100,000 protesters take over our capital, not for a few hours, but for nearly a month. And then there were protesters all around the state. And I remember jumping on a plane, and one of the flight crew guys just rushed up and handed me a piece of paper, a little scrap. Opened it up, it was Isaiah 54:17. And it was like, no sword cast against you shall prevail. And I thought, wow, this is like an angel, sent to minister, to reinforce. If you think you're doing the right thing, stay there. But other times too. I mean, there was a time when I was, in the midst of all this, as difficult as it was gaining national attention. I remember I probably was starting to get a little full of myself over some of the attention. And I ended up being pranked. Someone had impersonated somebody else who'd called, and even though my staff somehow should have, sorted it through, it got through. And I remember my staff the next day was like, "What do we do?" And I said, "We just got, just come out and tell the truth, tell what happened," and took it. It wasn't a very easy thing to do. I get back into my office, and not just my daily devotion, but one that I think it was early that week, one of the state lawmakers had given me, and prayed about it and said, I just feel like it's compelled for you. That day I opened it up because I hadn't had a chance to look at it before the press conference. And the scripture was all about humility. And I literally remember looking up in the conference room in my office saying, "Okay, God, I hear you." But it was good. It was a gut check to get back to the why, not just the what we were doing, but why were we doing this? And it's something we've stressed, not just when I was governor, but my staff ever since then, that, God said to Nehemiah, before you rebuild the walls, you have to understand why they came down in the first place. If you explain the why, if you really understand that and you're doing it for the right reasons, the what will follow.
And you've done your political career with incredible integrity all along the way. I saw an interview with you one time where you were talking about a turning point during some of the complicated things that were going on, where you had actually been speaking, I think, at the Special Olympics.
Oh, yeah.
And a bunch of protesters showed up there, and you chose not to engage, and it ended up being a turning point. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It really was. And I'd been going to this long before I was governor. There's a law enforcement torch run all across the state. I'd been doing it for 20 years. I was running out with sheriff deputies and officers. So this first year I'm governor, all the protests are going on in the Capitol, but I'm not going to miss this because it's so important. We're outside, so I'm fully exposed. And for whatever reason, that day, the protesters came dressed as, get this, zombies. Oh. So they had paint on their face, and they're coming out. And, here's all these law enforcement professionals. They all have different colored T-shirts on for their units. The Special Olympians come out. They've got their special shirts. And these protesters, just with no regard to these athletes, come between me and the athletes. And like any of us, my first reaction was to want to call them out. Like, you're idiots. What are you doing? Not just for my sake, but thinking... But I looked, thankfully, it was looking in these innocent faces of the athletes who were not troubled. They were listening to what I was saying. They thought it was just more of the festivities going on. Didn't take them away from it. And it was in one of those moments of God's providence where I just stayed focused on talking to them, ignored the protesters. Well, little did I know, the media captured all that. And instead of the story, had I gone with my impulse, a natural impulse, the story would have been me at odds with the protesters. But instead, the story was about the protesters getting in the face of these Special Olympic athletes. And that really was a turning point, because I think there were a lot of people in the state who either disagreed with me or didn't know quite what to think, who said, that's not us. We can disagree with this guy, but these people are not like us. There's something wrong. These must be people from outside of the state. And it really was an eye-opener.
So we've talked a little bit about your political career. Obviously a family man too. Tell us a little bit about your family.
So Tonette and I, coming up in a few weeks, we've been married 32 years, met less than a year before that, was love at first sight. Knew, she laughs. It took her a little more time to figure out we were going to get married than me. I knew that night, the very first time we went out to dinner, and spent a long time talking, from dinner to ice cream to everything in between. But we were married, we met, first date was May 1st, proposed August 20th, married February 6th. Like I said, we'll be celebrating our 32nd anniversary. Blessed the next 2 years after that with Matthew and Alex, who came one after another. And part of the reason why we picked Matthew was because Tonette had been a widow before we were married, so she didn't know if she could get married again, let alone have children. And so in Hebrew, Matthew means a matan, or a gift from Yahweh. And both those sons we're blessed now, have found wonderful Christian and conservative young women, so it makes it a lot easier in our household. Sure. One just got married on New Year's Eve, and the other about a year and a half ago. Oh,
congratulations. Thanks. Makes conservative spouses makes Thanksgiving, I think, a little bit more special, probably.
Well, particularly in our house, because being the son of a preacher involved in politics, the two things you're not supposed to talk about, politics and religion, are always talked about in our house. So it's nice to have people on each level that are on the similar planes.
I read, too, that your anniversary happens to be Ronald Reagan's birthday, and Ronald Reagan was a significant influence of yours. Tell us how he influenced your decision to enter into politics and your even philosophy.
Yeah, I think probably as a young man in the 80s when he was president, there's probably no greater influence by an adult other than my parents in terms of at least politically, ideologically, what I believe in. There were other great influences, good teachers, people from the American Legion, a World War I veteran that I grew up down the block from, Mr. Condon, but probably politically, at least in terms of not just politics, but ideas, and not just to be a conservative or even a Republican, but one of the things I admire the most about Reagan that I was drawn to young and still am today is his optimism, his eternal belief in the American people. I've seen it growing up. I see it now when I go out to his old ranch, Rancho del Cielo, the ranch in the skies, which we're pleased at my group to be now the guardian of. That just this belief, this endless, openless potential. I remember in one of his addresses at the convention, he talked about America being a shining city on the hill, drawn right out of Scripture, and just such a powerful, powerful influence. Strong, but yet decent. I like to think some of that's Midwestern roots. Right. But as much as he's appropriately mired today, he had his challenges. Many in the media and many politically were out to get him all throughout his time in office, both as governor and later as president. But today, thankfully, I think as time has shown us, he stands the test of time. And that was a great inspiration to me to want to replicate the kinds of things he did, particularly when I held office.
You referenced the Reagan Ranch and the organization that you're now working with. You're now the president of the Young America's Foundation. Tell our audience a little bit about the Young America's Foundation.
Yeah, YF.org, YF.org, if people are interested, if you got kids, might be college, high school, now even middle school kids. The ranch is one of our many assets. We have programs out in California where President Reagan's ranch is exactly like he left it. We took it over in 1998. Right from Mrs. Reagan, who left the boots, the gear, everything is, as his son Michael Reagan often says to us, and he's a part of our programs, as is his daughter, Ashley, the president's granddaughter. They feel like the president could just walk right back in again, as if he was here today. But we have him elsewhere in Washington, D.C., in the Midwest, in his boyhood home in Dixon, and at places all around the country. We also do more conservative lectures on college campuses than any other group in America. And then we broadcast this. So someone like a Ben Shapiro or a Ben Carson, one speed extreme to the other, but both are very popular, as are many others, speakers for us on campuses. We broadcast those on YAF TV, our YouTube channel, which now has nearly 2 million subscribers. And last year, we just surpassed over 1.6 billion views. So it's a great way to, but we're not political. We're not young Republicans, although we do a lot of lectures for college Republicans. But what we're about is we're a nonprofit that teaches the principles of what Reagan had me growing up on: free enterprise, individual liberties, strong national defense, traditional American values, a love for our country. As I like to say, simply put, at Young America's Foundation, we train the next generation of leaders in the fight for freedom.
Yeah. Speaking of those next generations, what are you seeing are some of the trends from those emerging generations?
Well, overall, we do polling all the time. We're in the field right now with yet another poll. One of the interesting things across the political spectrum, regardless of where they're at, liberal, conservative, and most young people are in between. They're like a lot of voters in swing states. They're not as liberal as the media would make you think. They're certainly not all conservative, so they're just kind of curious. But one thing we found that's consistent is Generation Z is very into authenticity and fairness. So when you see something go viral, part of the reason why we broadcast all these lectures is not just for the lecture, but the Q&A, the interaction. And Ben Shapiro really perfected this, but now others do the same, where at the Q&A time, if you disagree with me, you go get in line, you raise your hand, you go right to the front. It makes for a great video for sure, great TV as we used to call it, but it's also engaging for those others in the audience, because, and not just in person, but online, because they've heard typically one side of the story. They haven't heard the other side of the story. And so they're hungry for this. There's a great hunger. So we see oftentimes when there's a good dialogue in the Q&A, those numbers go up. We've had with Shapiro some that have gone as high as 28, 29 million views on some of those interchanges, which just, again, tells me there's a hunger out there. And then fairness. I personally think one of the mistakes many conservatives would make is we think and talk with our head. The left often thinks and talks with their heart. We need to think with our head, but speak from the heart. Or as I like to say, you appreciate this, I said the greatest teacher I've ever heard of told parables. Yeah. So tell stories that reinforce your logic, but tell it from an emotional standpoint, much more powerful.
Well, we're so grateful that you are here with us this evening for the Bonita Christian Forum, and thank you for joining us with Behind the Forum as well. Our guest this evening has been Governor Scott Walker, who is serving at the Young America's Foundation. Just a reminder, go check out yaf.org. And we thank you for joining us for this. Tune in to our next episode when our guest will be Miss Rachel Denhollander. She was a former gymnast. Now she's a lawyer who is in the fight for young women in America. We hope that you'll join us for that episode. Thanks for joining.